D called us last night, and D is not his full name, and he has asked that we not divulge that, but I've had some background conversation with him, and he is a wealth of understanding and a wealth of knowledge about what's going on in Washington, D.C., and I wanted to bring him back on today to talk to some of you good people about what we know, what we don't know, what we can extrapolate from the action that happened just the other day on the Potomac River. D, thanks for being on with us. Good afternoon, sir.
Hey, man, that's a hard segue.
I know. From,
I'm involved in training somebody right now, and we convinced him that his primary trainer was hard of hearing. So the first time they met, he screamed in his ear, thinking he was doing the right thing, and hilarity ensued. So that's a great segue into this one.
Dean, give us a little, for those who missed the call last night, because it was toward the end of the show, just give us a little bit of your background and what you did for years up in Virginia and the Washington, D.C. area.
So I was both active duty and National Guard air crew, as you said, a crew chief. And those years in the Guard, our local flying area was the D.C. metro and Virginia area. So, that route was a common route for us, day, night, all times of year, all different type missions. So, the night that this happened, I'd gone to bed already, but when I woke up, it was a really tight friend group, and we're all texting around, hey, do you know who it was? Do you know anything? Because for the longest time, we thought it was possibly somebody we knew or, we're still in touch with. But during the Guard time, I was also, and I'm still currently in law enforcement and, train Fed guys up there, in protective services and close protection and things like that. So, kind of wired into the district in several different ways.
So you were a crew chief on these Blackhawks.
That's correct.
And describe, and we kind of have to start from the beginning on these things. So the crew chief does what, sits where, and if you have a 3-person crew in a helicopter, just explain that to me. What is normal operating procedure?
So the technical term for crew chief is non-rated crew members. You have a set of wings, you are part of the flight crew, but you are not trained to fly. So you are a mechanic and a flight attendant that in combat has a machine gun out the window, but you serve, several things. We can assist in navigation. We assist on the radios occasionally when the crew is overtasked, and several other things. For a part of the time, it was a medevac mission, so you may be handing medical supplies or IVs as well. But anything that goes on behind the pilots, the crew chief is in charge of.
You told me earlier today, and I want to talk about it on radio so people can hear this, that part of what you're hearing that you think might be leading to a certain level of misinformation is the term training exercise.
That's correct.
Just walk me through, when you hear training exercise, what does that mean to you, and how do you think that people can kind of misperceive what that means?
So I think if there weren't a specific mission, especially for that unit, if they're not carrying a VIP from point A to point B, then they're calling it, or at least the press seems to be calling it, a training mission. But there would be 2 types of missions where you're not tasked. One would be a training mission in which one of the pilots would be an instructor pilot, and they might practice different procedures and emergency procedures. Then there's a proficiency flight where neither pilot needs to be an instructor, but you go out and accomplish the task that you would do normally flying just to maintain proficiency. So that could be flying under goggles. It could be landing at a grass airstrip at, say, Fort A.P. Hill, or just flying around, or flying under instrument conditions, even though you're not under instrument, just practicing those conditions. So I think it's yet to be officially determined, was this a training flight or was this a proficiency flight?
You traveled, in your experience, you did these same flight paths. Is that correct?
That's correct.
How many of these helicopter flights would you say happen in any given week or any given month or even any given day?
In any given day, you've probably got between 50 and 100 of those. On a good day. Now, remember, those routes are only open when you have visual flight rules, when you can see everything. If it's foggy, if it's raining, if it's cloudy, if you're near the clouds, those don't happen. But on a clear day like today, You could have, and it's not just the military. You've got the D.C. police, U.S. Park Police, Maryland State Police, and then a slew of medevacs that go back and forth to the hospitals using those routes.
So, Dee, why is it, and forgive I feel like I'm going to ask questions that might seem a little ignorant to you, but I think it's important for the listening audience. So, why is it necessary for these helicopters to be in DCA airspace? In other words, why do they have to navigate around commercial aircraft at all?
Well, it's just a matter of there's not enough real estate. So, for those that don't know, DC is right there on the river, and nearby you've got Dulles, you've got Baltimore, you've got Andrews Air Force Base,
right.
And then Quantico actually has a long strip for loading the presidential helicopters on the C-17s and whatnot. So you've got just those aircraft, or those airspaces that are all controlled, and you've got to be able to navigate between points in the city while avoiding that air traffic. So it necessitates those low-level helicopter routes. New York City has the same that go up near the Statue of Liberty, and I'm sure Chicago probably has some routes like that. But anywhere you've got a large concentration of airports, but a necessity to move helicopters, you're going to have routes of that type.
And has it not been considered problematic before we saw this horrific crash? In other words, I don't know that I could recall a helicopter crashing into a commercial flight ever in the history of American aviation. Maybe it's happened. I don't recall it. So was it just not considered to be an issue so long as we followed the rules, followed the parameters, and everybody did their job?
Well, it's very structured, and you didn't have the benefit of most of that radio traffic and everything that's out there. But let's say if we take off from Quantico or Davidson, because this is where these guys came from, Davidson, which is in the area. It's barely off the river. You come up the river and then to D.C. So once you take off from Davidson, you establish contact with DCA well before you've gotten there for permission to enter the routes. Then along the routes, there are several checkpoints, Key Bridge, Cabin John, CIA, different things that you call out. So even if they don't have you on radar because you're low, that controller has a mental picture of where you are. And generally, you've communicated where you're going ultimately. Then there's another set of areas or airspaces called zones, which are over the city, and not many people use those. Only DC police, Capitol Police, or maybe the helicopters going to medevac scenes. But so that's another separate set of low-level areas that are controlled by that same controller.
A couple of questions, because I know you're busy and I know you're limited on time. So you talked about, I asked you about the necessity of doing these things. Is there a necessity that these helicopters cross the flight path? And in the normal operational day, what is that like, and what changed to our knowledge in this circumstance?
Yeah, those routes are designed with maximum altitudes to deconflict aircraft. So I think as the media is widely reporting now, 200 is the maximum altitude to cross that area. And that's to deconflict based on the approach path for that runway. And of course, that's just it's necessary to make those routes contiguous. Now, one thing that we would do as a crew, being in controlled airspace or even uncontrolled airspace, is if we're going to cross the center line of a runway, even if we're cleared, the pilot and command is going to announce, hey, we're crossing the center line. And, guys on both sides of the aircraft are going to, check and say, okay, there's nobody departing. And the other might say, okay, there's nobody inbound. So, there's definitely a positive exchange of information that, hey, we know we're crossing a center line and we don't see anything coming.
And you're doing that inside the helicopter. So,
yep, absolutely.
So people are asking, is it normal to have 3 crew members and not more?
A minimum for a nighttime flight with goggles is 3. It's better to have 4.
Okay.
It's not required. And honestly, if a Blackhawk is out flying in the daytime, a sunny day, just getting a proficiency flight, they don't need a crew chief at all. Now, the risk numbers go up for that. There's a risk matrix, and depending on what you're doing and how many people you have, but you can fly a Blackhawk with just 2 pilots if you're just out doing chingos or things like that.
Dee, what about you mentioned the different elevations that you would normally fly. We're being told that this helicopter was at 350 feet. That's is that above standard operating procedure?
And in my recollection, 200 is the max through there, so absolutely. When you get up north of DC, I think you can get up to around 300 or 350 over 495, but you're way away from the airports at that time. But yeah, the 200 would be the max, so 300 would likely be a problem.
Is that the biggest concern when you look at this situation, given the number of flights that you've been on in that specific area? I mean, I would expect you've crossed this flight path any number of times in your experience.
Yeah, and just thinking back, we didn't see operations from that runway as much as we did from the other direction. And the other direction is probably, if your listeners fly regularly into DCA, when you come down over the rivers and you can see the monuments out the window, there's a part called Gravelly Point, and it's a really good plane spotting thing, but you come in from north to south generally, and for some reason, I don't know if it was the winds or what was going on, they were operating from a different direction. So the way they were landing that night is unusual from my experience, but not impossible. I don't know what the reason for having the traffic flow that way was.
So we've been told we're getting a flood of information regarding air traffic control and what was and was not told to the helicopter. Just without leading you in any particular direction, what have you heard and what looks like normal operating procedure and what seems odd, if anything? Well,
as we talked about yesterday, normally there's one person in that tower dedicated to the helicopter routes and another dedicated to arrivals at DCA. To me, it appeared evident that it was the same person handling both stations, which to me is very unusual, even late at night. And you can definitely, those guys are professionals. I've never had an issue. I think that they're some of the hardest working, smartest people in the world. And, he sounded maybe he was a bit overtasked, but definitely there was not a second person there when there should have been.
All right, so walk me through what normal would have been like on one of your flights. So you're just communicating with someone at air traffic. So why is it that the military? Let me take a step back. The military is communicating with a commercial air traffic control tower, or maybe I don't understand what I need to understand. Why would the military be communicating with DCA at all? Just start there.
Well, so every airport, DCA or BNA or whatever, owns the airspace immediately around the airport. And then as you get further away from the airport, it's less controlled at lower altitudes. Mm-hmm. So, an airliner, for example, when it takes off from BNA, talks to the tower first, then it talks to another place called departures, then it talks to the centers that control high altitude traffic across the country. As it descends, it starts talking to the approach for the receiving airport, which hands it off to the tower for the receiving airport. Okay, so whenever you're flying fast and high, you're always under control. Lower level operations are only controlled, and there are different classes of airspace, DCA being one of the top classes. So anything that moves around DCA is going to talk to DCA because they own the sky there. So whether you're civilian or military, those controllers own it. Now, if you're flying out over, Lebanon, where there's a little airport but no control tower, it's sort of on the pilots to talk to the airport on their frequency and to talk to each other, but no one's actually in control of that airspace.
So,
does that make sense?
No, it does. So is there no mechanism within the Blackhawk itself to alert the crew that they're too high? That their elevation is above what it should be? I mean, because it seems to me that for whatever reason, they did not get that alert from air traffic control, correct?
So they didn't, ATC didn't let them know, which I think commonly that would happen. This was a Lima model Blackhawk, and that tells me that instead of, like you see on a modern airliner or a modern helicopter, a glass cockpit, all computer screens, these are still the old gauges. So you've got a separate altimeter, you've got a radar altimeter, you've got a, vertical horizon or artificial horizon. You've got all kinds of different gauges. And you can go through and set bugs to kind of let you know what your maximum altitude you want. But on that route, those change. It's really upon non-flying pilot and the flying pilot to watch the radar altimeter and just be aware of what altitude they're running at that time.
And so it is their first priority, and then it is a priority, one would think, of in a normal circumstance, the dedicated individual in the air traffic control center that is following all of the helicopter traffic.
That's correct.
In a normal situation. So I'm going to ask you to do something that I don't think guys that do these types of things like to do, but your best guess, I mean, have you ever had an experience where you were 150 feet variance of elevation and nobody noticed it?
Not me, but a sister aircraft in Iraq we were on one of the last missions as Iraq closed down. The two pilots were engaged, I hate to admit it, and this is in the other aircraft, it's only anecdotal, were engaged in an argument, and they were slowly drifting towards the ground, and it wasn't until 50 feet above the ground when one of the crew chiefs asked what in the world they were doing, did they realize what was happening and pull up. So, especially in low-light situations, you just don't have, as good visibility, and with all those lights, something may have distracted them. And so, 100 feet can get away from you pretty fast. So, it's not unheard of. It can definitely happen.
We don't hear, or we have not heard communication, at least I've not, from the helicopter to air traffic control.
Yeah, and you might not, because they should generally be talking on a UHF channel, and those aren't available to civilian radios. That's only a military government band. ATC has it, but civilians and those ATC websites and stuff that people listen to wouldn't generally hear the communications. Now, when the tower keys up and talks to the military aircraft, generally that transmission goes across both bands so the airliners can hear it and the military guys can hear it, but you might not hear any of the responses on the recordings that are available. Now, once the FAA, lets the traffic tapes go, you might be able to hear it.
So, and there's so many different ways to go here. So, in your analysis and based on your experience in these helicopters doing these types of flights, what's your best analysis as to how this could have potentially happened?
Well, I mean, we're never going to know until we know, and you hate to make a knee-jerk.
I mean, I understand that.
Just from my experience, I think there are multiple failures likely. Understaffing in the control tower, and I feel sorry for that gentleman who was working the tower that night. I'm sure he is carrying 68 bodies on his shoulders right now, and he feels terrible. And anybody would, but, it's not his fault, the staffing, and I think he probably did the best job he could. But, I think that, the FAA might have failed everybody by, not having adequate staffing. And who knows what was going on in that aircraft at the time. I mean, that's the unknown, and we may never know. But
are those Blackhawks equipped with voice cockpit in the cockpit?
Everyone I've ever been in has had it. I don't know why they don't have it in that one, or they're saying they don't have it. It might be because that VIP model is a bit heavier, and maybe they've had to, discard some things that they thought weren't necessary. But every aircraft I've operated in, as I recall, had those. So I'm not sure why that's not the case here.
I know it's early on to ask a question like this, and I appreciate D is with us. D has flown these flights numerous times over his 10 plus years of experience in Virginia. He's now in the state of Tennessee. D, early to ask this, but with this happening, I mean, I guess I would say with the number of flights that have been done in the past, I don't know that we've quite answered whether or not it is absolutely necessary for helicopter traffic to fly across the descending flight path. I mean, would you consider it necessary in that area for that to happen in the future?
I mean, I think it has to, or it's just going to cause a number of other problems, because those routes were designed to be the least intrusive, I believe. And this is a unique situation, and it's a tragic situation. And I'm sure there's going to be some change, but I really don't know what, because, you know, all the air crews, be it Army or law enforcement or medevac, they are all professionals. And, you know, this has been going on for years without incident. And so, you know, it's a shame that it happened, but I just don't think that they'll ever be able to justify eliminating those routes, because too many life-saving, you know, the medevacs alone, it's critical for that.
Well, but time. I'm not, you know, arguing with you about it, because I get what you're saying, but at the same time, I mean, you know, how important is a training mission for the military when we just saw 68 people die?
Well, that's true. I mean, they may limit, they may say, hey, you know, or you have to get a special clearance if you're going to do that, right. You know, that type of thing. Maybe somebody at a higher level is going to have to sign off on that mission. Right. And maybe they'll say, okay, for proficiency, we're not going to do it. But then on the other hand, you've got to keep people trained on those routes, because you need to be proficient on those routes to operate on those routes. So, right. But, you know, typical government fashion, somebody's going to probably overreact, and it's going to be painful for a while, but we'll see. But, you know,
in the modern world, Dee, and you and I don't know each other well. I want to get to know you better, because you seem so knowledgeable and sensible about these things. But in the modern world, there's wild speculation, obviously, on social media platforms. And a lot of the speculation has centered around whether or not this potentially could have been intentional. And I have to ask you the question, what do you see in some of the video surveillance that we have seen? I mean, I'm not asking you about intentionality. I'm asking you about what have you seen in that video evidence that would indicate to you what was going on in the minutes or the seconds before impact? Because a lot of people are saying, well, in this video that I saw, it looks like the helicopter just flew right into the airplane. And honestly, to someone that doesn't know, it does kind of look like that.
Yeah, you know, I can see that. But I'm going to tell you, I've known hundreds of pilots over my life, and, you know, if somebody could take that Blackhawk and hit that CRJ with accuracy, they're probably better than Chuck Yeager. I mean, it would take a pretty good pilot to do that on purpose. You know, again, speculation is always bad in these things, but it has to be, in my opinion, some sort of distraction in the cockpit. Maybe they were looking at the other aircraft that was nearby, you know, or they were focusing on, because the direction the aircraft was headed, you know, it's likely they were setting up for landing at Davidson Army Airfield. So maybe somebody grabbed a checklist and was getting ready to start the before landing checklist for Davidson. Maybe they were tuning one of the other radios to Davidson's frequency. You know, something could have distracted them inside. But I mean, I just don't, you know, some of the Malaysia flight, this was on purpose kind of things, maybe. But I'm telling you, it'd be impossible to smack anything moving with a Blackhawk. Those, you know, that's ludicrous to me.
Incredible information. Is there anything I've missed before we let you go, Dee?
No, I mean, you know, it's good vigilance. I hate that it happened. Those are the most professional aviators in the world, some of the best air traffic controllers in the world. It's, you know, I would encourage, if you're ever on vacation in D.C., go to that gravelly point, especially if you like aircraft, but just go to that gravelly point and just see for yourself. I mean, it's a plane landing every 3 minutes right over your head. It's almost like that St. Martin Beach, you know, where the people gather and watch planes land. It's really interesting to watch. It's a nice park with people grilling out. But if you ever get a chance to visit it, you'll sort of understand, you know, what goes on. But it's just a neat place to go anyway. But, I mean, thanks for, you know, giving a platform to sort of dispel some of the crazy, you know, things that people are saying out there, because it's getting pretty ridiculous. Well,
like I told you earlier in our call, I mean, you know, in times of man-made or unfortunate disaster, we try to make sense of the senseless, and sometimes a lot of this seems senseless. I mean, my first reaction was, how in the world could this happen? And I think we're going to spend days and weeks, if not years, trying to piece together exactly that.